The following podcast is an Embassy Row production.
Hey everybody, I'm Marc Lamont Hill. I am a professor, a scholar, and most importantly, a book nerd. I say book nerd because I don't just love to read books, I'm the person who loves to read about the book. I love hearing authors talk about how and why they wrote the book, and I love talking to other book nerds about their favorite books. That's why I started Coffee and Books. It's a podcast all about books. Every episode, I sit down over a cup of coffee with the world's biggest authors to discuss the most interesting, controversial, fun, or important books. Sometimes we'll hang out with experts, fans, and other special guests to talk about some of the greatest books of all time. And today, I am so excited to be joined by a wonderful author and a dear friend, Mychal Denzel Smith. He is the author of a new book, Stakes is High, Life After the American Dream. Mychal, good to see you.
Man, always. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Now, every episode, I have to find out what people are drinking. I always drink coffee for the show. It's called Coffee and Books. And the last few weeks, I've been on a black coffee kick. So I'm actually drinking just another cup of La Colombe plain black coffee. It gives me some energy for interviews and for reading. What are you drinking? Do you drink coffee?
I'm not a coffee drinker. It sets me apart from so many of my writer friends who drink coffee and smoke cigarettes.
You don't do either.
If I'm real drunk, I might smoke a cigarette. But I did get some coffee to join you with. It's decaf because caffeine is the reason that I don't drink coffee. It just like makes me real jittery. But I also, because I listened to you and Eddie Glaude talk about Baldwin and the coffee and cognac, there's some cognac in here. So that's where I am right now.
Oh, nice. That's going to make this interview even better. I should get right to it. Stakes is High is your second book. Of course, your first book was a memoir. Invisible Man Got the Whole World Watching. This book, Stakes is High, Life After the American Dream, is a work of cultural criticism, social analysis. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like the first one is also that. I think there's always this blend of things that I'm doing. I think the first one, Invisible Man Got the Whole World Watching, is much more rooted in my life and more rooted in me telling stories that way. Yeah. Where this one, it's not as much, but it is me doing that sort of observational work that can be a part of memoir and like relating some of those things to bring home the ideas, right? Like, I think that's the whole reason for me, at least, to be writing about the personal, is to bring those ideas home for people in a way that maybe through the analysis they're not catching.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And in this book, you begin us in one of the low moments of this young 21st century for many people. You start with the 2016 election.
Yeah, I mean, I was running away from it at first, right? Like my first book came out in 2016, summer 2016, and I really wasn't paying attention to electoral politics. I was on the road and doing all the interviews. You know, we did stuff together that summer because Nobody came out also that summer. So I wasn't really paying attention to electoral politics that much. And I like a lot of people, I was just assuming Hillary Clinton was going to win. You know, it wasn't my preferred candidate. I don't like the way that there's presidential worship in this country that I talk about in Stakes is High, and the way that so much power is rested in the presidency and all of that. But I just assumed Hillary Clinton would win. And we had our marching orders for those of us who are a little further left than what is represented in mainstream politics, is that, okay, we give people their moment to celebrate this sort of like monumental, historic moment, first woman president of the United States. But then you organize and you push and you continue doing the things that you're doing, because Hillary Clinton's politics are still antithetical to justice in the ways that we understand it. But like a lot of people, I sat there watching the returns come in and feeling like, oh shit, he's going to win. Like Donald Trump is going to be president of the United States. And I had to sit with that and had to sit with my own feelings around why I thought it was impossible, why I believed that was just outside the realm of what was likely or possible within American politics in 2016. and then say to myself, well, that's because I bought into the delusion too. I bought into the idea that someone like Trump has been ousted from polite society within America, whereby, like, yes, people still adopt the policies, but the rhetoric, the way that he went about his bloviating in ways that they're simply directly bigoted and racist and harmful and violent, that had been pushed out, and that he was no longer representative of where the mainstream was. And I was wrong. Like so many of us were wrong. And then to remember this country's history, and to situate him within that.
When you talked about this wrongness, it wasn't just that you had miscalculated where we were as a nation. It wasn't just that you didn't have the right read of the political kind of climate. You're talking about something more fundamental. You're talking about the very heart of American identity and who we think we are versus who we actually are. And in many ways, the book is forcing us to wrestle with those contradictions. Who does America think it is? What is the American identity?
I mean, I would love to just boil it down and just say like this, but it's that we think we are a country that always stands on the side of justice, right? That always stands on the side of equality, and that we tell our history in exactly that way. So we tell the story of the Civil War not as if this was, a nation bitterly divided on the question of slavery and enslaving people, but a sort of like family rift that we needed to get over, and that, and then we established the freedom of African peoples here in the United States. Well, what you don't then deal with is the century and a half of enslaving people here, right? And that part's not American, right? Like, the American part is always the
good stuff
part, right? Like, it's always
in the book. You said this. You said our faults are not American, only the progress. Ending slavery is American. The institution itself was not. Extending the vote to white women via constitutional amendment is American. Denying them the vote for more than a century of the nation's existence was not. For the myth to hold, we can only ever view America as the sum of its best parts.
Yeah. And that's what gives people committed to America and the American identity, that foundation, right? Like, because you tell the best parts of America, you can always believe that America comes out on top no matter what, and that whatever wrong you see, no, America will correct that. That's obvious. We will at some point, right? Like, it's maybe some point in the distant future, but you're just like, yeah, no, that's obviously we'll get to that. That'll be fine. And so then when you believe yourself to be the summation of only the good parts as a country, right, as a historical record of the country, then you as a person too, who adopts the identity of American, also believe yourself to be that too, right? And what I wanted to do with the book, though, is say, look, I've been a critic of that. I've been a critic of that stance. I've been a critic of American empire, American capitalism, American racism, and so on and so forth. I've been a critic of all those things that make up the American identity. But I'm not absolved either, is that I too am a product of those things. I'm a product of America. And I have gone through those phases where I have not deeply interrogated my relationship to these desires, to see myself as good, to see myself situated in a place that's always getting better, to view places within the United States as some sort of bastion of freedom from the rest of the country, as if it's not also reflective of the very ideas that are at the heart. So I talk a lot about New York City. It's like, that's my home. That's the place that I've chosen as a home, as if I was choosing New York City as some place outside of America, outside of American history.
And particularly the American South. I mean, one of the things in the book that I thought was interesting is when you talk about the New York subway cars, and you talk a lot in chapter 2, the justice chapter around New York. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you talked about was like, when you're in New York for a while, you realize that that subway car that's empty is empty for a reason. You didn't you didn't luck up. That's empty because something going on in there that everybody else already know about. And then when you found out that there's an extraordinarily pungent odor coming from there, and you realize that it's because someone who is unhoused is living there and forced due to lack of resources to use that train car as both a sleeping quarter and a bathroom, that suddenly everybody wants to kind of walk away from that person. And you said that you yourself kind of will distance yourself from that, but then make yourself feel better by trying to give money to somebody or do some other act of kind of charity to cover up the deeper structural issue that you have to wrestle with.
Yeah, and we're all doing that all the time, but never putting those things in dialogue with one another, right? And never putting those things into context to say that the individual act that I'm committing, one of like protecting myself from the odor, right? Like it stinks and I don't want to be around that. I don't want to have to breathe that air in. But that's connected to the very hostility that we enact to the unhoused through policy. Is to say that I want distance from those people that are making my experience unpleasant, right? And so then you send out police forces to handle that, or you know what I mean? And so the policy is built around a deep uncaring that we exhibit in our actions every day. And so then you try to assuage your own guilt. And like I do, it's to say, oh yeah, a man's asking for $5. This woman is coming up to me, like telling me this story about like all these hardships and everything. If I got it, I'll give it to them because, you know, hopefully that makes their day. But what would actually make their day, what would make their life better, more sustainable, like would be to be housed, to have access to clean food, to have clean clothes, to be able to use the bathroom. I just think, it's just so callous to me living in New York City with so many unhoused people that we also have so few public restrooms, right? that there's no place for unhoused people to just go and just like splash some water on their face, right? And that's policy, but you see that acted out in an interpersonal way as well.
It's really interesting because people would say, well, the public restrooms aren't for unhoused people. In some ways, that's true, right? It's that when we think about the public and who constitutes the public, they're considered outside of the public. It speaks to their lack of full participation in a democratic citizenry and their lack of being counted as full human beings. And you talk about in the book the lack of investment in public housing, to be sure, public restrooms. You talk about in the hood, there not being a lot of trash cans.
No, trash cans, man. Like there's more police on my block than trash cans.
It struck me, when you said lack of trash cans. I think about trash in the hood, and I think about all sorts of things. You made the point that, we kind of reduce it to a kind of those cultural deficit narratives where it's like, oh, well, poor people just like to throw shit on the ground and rich people don't. But then you make an interesting pivot as you're starting to do now, and you say, but the one thing we invest in is police.
Yes.
Talk to me about, because your book, particularly the second chapter, really gets at this policing thing, and you go deep into not just what police do, but their roots, their origins, their fundamental purpose. I mean, you really unpack this police thing. Talk to me about why that was important to you to do and also what that function is.
Because we have to ask the question, why is that the one public resource that my neighborhood gets? With this neighborhood full of working poor and unhoused people, Black folk that are immigrants largely, right? Like, why is it that the greatest public resource that they have access to is the police? Well, that's because that's been the function of the police since their beginning, right? Like you have a second-class citizenry, and you have to enforce that second-class citizenship onto them. And you use the violent mechanisms of the state to enforce that identity on them, and the lack of everything that they lack in terms of resources. You say to them, you are confined here. You can't go anywhere else. All of your behaviors that you do for survival, we've criminalized. And then we make you beholden to low-wage jobs that have no room for advancement and that will keep you in this neighborhood. Because we need you to be servants to us, right? We need you to be servants to our capitalist system because we need cheap labor. That all of those things are connected to one another. And the police system ensures that one, you get the message, right? Like just their very presence gives you the message that we think that you're worthy of this. This is what you deserve. But then also the very nature of policing in terms of what an arrest looks like, what having a record looks like, what that then commits you to in terms of access to public housing, access to jobs, right? Like you are locked in. And that's what the function of policing has always been. And so I trace that history because I want people to understand this isn't a deviation from what police are doing in terms of protecting and serving. Understand that as a PR slogan, right? Like that is literally the LAPD in the 1950s saying that we need better public relations. So what we do is we adopt the slogan to protect and serve. And that seems like to the community, oh, the police are here for us. Well, the police have always, from the time of the formalizing of police departments in this country, what they do in cities like New York and Boston is to quell labor rebellions, right? Like they are out there using violence to ensure that mostly, even then, white laborers in their movements, their protests are completely squashed. And then in the South, police forces arise as slave catchers, right? Like they are there to ensure the return of white people's property, which are human beings, to them. This is exactly what they've done from the beginning. And so then you transition into the formalizing of those police forces, and then they start dealing with things in the late 19th century that have to do with vice, where it's gambling, it's prostitution, it's drugs, all of that they're then supposed to clean up the streets. Well, they're not successful, but what they are successful in is ensuring that they then again determine who is and who isn't worthy of certain public resources. Because at the same time you have that happening, you have the progressive movement in this nation that's identifying white ethnic groups and what they wouldn't have been defined as white at that time, but they're being folded into whiteness, like Irish and Italian ghettos that existed. People are saying, well, what's wrong with those people that they're living in these slums and they're dirty and they're uneducated? And then progressives come along and they say, well, it's because they lack all of these things, and we should build infrastructure to be able to get them access to those things. Well, the same thing is happening in Black neighborhoods across the country, but what we got was policing. And I think just identifying that history correlates to exactly what they're doing right now, what we continue to see with, the very killing of Breonna Taylor, right? That it's tied to gentrification.
Let me ask you about Breonna Taylor, because as we sit here, which is a few hours removed from the announcement that none of the officers involved in the killing of Breonna Taylor would be charged in her death, one officer was charged with wanton endangerment for shooting his gun recklessly, but those were the bullets that did not hit her. In fact, that was much more about the neighbors than it was Breonna Taylor. We're probably a couple hours away before nighttime and maybe the evening protests that will come. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but there's a really good chance that we'll see people taking to the streets again. In the book, you talk about the rebellion and the riot and that distinction. You talk about social unrest in the pursuit of justice. You didn't know that this was going to happen when you started writing the book, but in some ways you didn't have to. It seems like this is par for the course.
Yeah, I say in the book that Donald Trump was inevitable. This is also inevitable, because those forces of American history that give rise to Donald Trump are always going to then produce the conditions under which Black people rebel, right? And is to say that those things have always existed and they are there at the core of the American identity. And so, yeah, I didn't have to know that George Floyd was going to be killed and that someone was going to set fire to the Minneapolis police station. I didn't have to know that Breonna Taylor was going to be killed, because I didn't have to know their names. I just knew that they were it was going to be someone. And the anger is always going to crest, and it's always going to rise in these ways that, are going to be then picked over and chastised by this sort of establishment, the people who are invested in the status quo, invested in the maintenance of the system, to say that you are doing it wrong, you're going about it in a way that doesn't make people respect you. People didn't respect us in the first place. That's what the whole thing is. They didn't respect Breonna Taylor. They didn't respect her privacy. They didn't respect her home. They didn't respect George Floyd. They don't respect us at all. And so the anger then arises and we lash out and we do things that, and, we can look at what little has happened, right? And I think that there are little changes that do happen, right? Before they announced that they're not going to charge the police officers that killed Breonna Taylor, the city did announce a settlement, right? The largest settlement in Louisville's history with regards to police violence. But tied to that were some reforms. I don't think any of these reforms are actual like good reforms that are going to produce any different outcomes, but they were tied to some reforms. What are the reasons that they attached those reforms? It's because people spent the summer burning police cars in Louisville. This is not because of polite protest. This is only because people drew the attention of a nation, of the world, by virtue of their militant actions, a militant confrontation with state power. So it's always just like, you bring up in the book that I sort of talk about the distinction that gets made between a rebellion and a riot. It's just a matter of which side do you stand on? And then you have to ask yourself, why do I stand there?
That's a powerful one. It's a powerful distinction, and it's a serious question. It's not just a sort of political question, maybe even an existential one. The question of accountability comes up. It's a theme of the third section of the book, and you go into some interesting areas from sexual violence, Bill Cosby, R. Kelly, trans violence. Talk to me about why you wrote that chapter and how it connects to this broader idea of life after the American dream. Because for many people, the critique that you offer is about the state, it's about violence, it's about policing, it's about structures. And then in the third chapter, you make this interesting pivot that I think some readers may not have expected.
Yeah, I think in part that's why it's there. And I can say, from the craft perspective with the writing of this book, it initially started out as like 13 separate essays, almost 13 or 14, if I'm not mistaken. It was kind of modeled after Souls of Black Folks. That's why the first and last are called The Forethought and the Afterthought, as Du Bois does Souls of Black Folks. And I was thinking about these things as separate issues that I would handle within the context of a shortish essay. I don't know, like 3, maybe 4,000 words, right? But the problem with that I was having was in writing each of those individual ones, I was having trouble keeping stuff from other essays out of the one that I was writing in at the time, because I was seeing the connections and because I was like, the problem with separating it out that way would be people could pick up the book, identify the issue that they care about right now, and then read that essay and then be done. What I wanted in the third section that you're pointing out, I wanted one to connect the idea of myth making to the ways in which we respond to sexual violence, right? The American myth making, as we talked about earlier, is sort of always consuming the best parts of ourselves and always consuming the best parts of our history. Well, that's part of what goes into the ways in which we allow certain people to get away with sexual violence, is to say, I use Bill Cosby as this sort of avatar there to say that he constructed a myth of who he was. We connected Bill Cosby and Cliff Huxtable in our minds so much so they were interchangeable.
Right, like they're the same person, right?
Right. But so with that myth constructed and firmly implanted in people's psyche, it was hard for years to convince people that Bill Cosby could be that perpetrator, could be the perpetrator of such heinous violence. Well, I wanted to make that connection also, but to then say, we're looking then at Bill Cosby having fallen because of the just the long record, right? But what justice has been served? How accountable has he been held if he's locked away in prison and will likely die in prison? And I wanted to then discuss how that relates to the ideas of abolition. We need to tear down the very systems that have been constructed as facsimile of justice, but don't serve anyone, either victim or perpetrator. They don't stop.
That's an interesting point, right? Because it's hard as a moral practice, as an ethical practice, to be protective of people who do harm to us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the aftermath of George Floyd, a lot of people said, yeah, but he had a criminal record, or yeah, he engaged in certain forms of violence. How do we keep track of the harm people do while still keeping track of their humanity and the need to defend them against a state that thinks all of us deserve to die?
Yeah. And that's why I walk through in that section to say, like, look, I'm also have harmed people. All of us have. If we look at our lives honestly, we have all harmed someone. You ask then the question, does harming someone mean that you are disposable yourself? Are you ready to give up on yourself? And look, I'm not trying to diminish what we identify as the behaviors that Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein or R. Kelly engaged in and the harm that they cause on the level that they cause it. I don't want to diminish that whatsoever because it is heinous. It's heinous, though, in the context, especially, that they were supported through all of this, that there was a societal and legal system that made it possible for them to continue to enact this harm for years and years. And no one could step in and say, like, where have you been hurt that you continue to hurt people? And that needed to start way before any of their assaults, right? Like, they needed to interrogate that from the very beginning. We needed to interrogate the messages that they received around sex and sexual violence and bodily autonomy. We needed to interrogate that a long time before they raped anyone. And so the person absolutely must be held accountable, but it is a societal problem. It is a structural problem. If you can punish that individual and still more of those people be produced.
If anybody's listening to this conversation, they might be thinking, yo, Mychal Denzel Smith really, really got some critique. He is not big on this whole America thing. But I think, despite the fact that that's all true to me, right? I think that's an accurate read of you. This is actually a deeply hopeful book. I find this book to be deeply hopeful. If I were weighing the amount of critique and pessimism versus the amount of hope word for word in terms of the word count, it's not a hopeful book. But by the end of the book, you take us some places and you give us reason to think not that victory or justice or freedom is inevitable, but that is possible, that is attainable. How do we get free?
Oh, man.
See how I snuck in the toughest question?
Yeah, man. You want me to write a whole nother book right now?
That's book number 3.
You know, and part of it is, to me, like, and this may be sort of evading your question, so I don't have to answer directly on a program of how we get free.
You are definitely becoming a seasoned author. He's like, I ain't answered none of these damn questions that I don't want to answer. Go ahead.
But what I want to point to is what you said right before that, is that you said that the book gives the sense that it is possible. And we have to believe that it's possible before anything else. It goes back to the 2016 election. I turned 30 2 days before the 2016 election day. I had brushed it off for quite some time before turning 30. I was like, it's not that meaningful. Like, people make too much of it. It's some bullshit, whatever. So what happened was about a month before I turned 30, I noticed something about myself. I'd gone up a waist size. It was the first time in my adult life that I had gained such significant weight that my pant size changed. And I can tell you, Mark, that shit fucked with me.
Oh,
I
believe it.
And it's because, like, I had this consistent vision of myself, and like that was just who I was, right? And suddenly it was being challenged. But also what that then did was set me on this path of thinking about, like, approaching 30 and just being like, I don't know who I'm supposed to be after 30. Because I had just written this entire book about Black male identity and the searching for it and trying to understand like how I was shaped and all of this. And like I say in the book, there were those major birthdays, like 18 and 21 and all. Had not anticipated seeing those. I assumed my own death for so long, like so many of us.
Yeah.
And so I reached that point as about 25 or so. I mean, even before that, you and I sat down and you told me I was going to write this book, essentially.
Yeah.
Right? And so that was always there. And so I wrote the book. I published the book. That's all I had. That's all I had planned for myself. Like there was no after that I assumed that was going to be possible for me, that was available to me. So I didn't imagine myself as like a 30-year-old Black man in America. I didn't imagine myself as a 40-year-old Black man in America. That just wasn't within the imagination. So here suddenly I was approaching 30 and it's like, I got to figure out who I'm going to be because apparently there is more. Apparently it is possible, right? So that's where that sort of hope comes from, is the realization in that moment that a life after that moment, more life was possible for me. Now, it did also coincide with the election of Donald Trump, in which 2 days later, I was like, well, maybe the world's going to end. So I don't know. Maybe I don't have to plan for being 30.
Right. I just got to ride this week out, see where it takes me.
But I think that's the tension in the book is trying to sit between both of those feelings and say, yeah, shit looks scary. The world is literally on fire. The rise of just white authoritarians across the globe. We look like we doomed. But what I was holding on to in the writing of this and then the publishing of it and everything after is to say that I didn't believe there was a life possible for me after 30 years old, but I'm here. It's possible. It's about how do we get there? How do we make the possible reality?
So you are a professional writer. When did you first identify as a writer?
I identified as a writer back in college. I worked for the school newspaper. It was the skill that I had. And it was because like through school, that was what always came easy to me. Like I could show up to my English class and we'd be reading some bullshit and they want me to write an essay. And it's just like, I half read it and then I could turn in my essay that I wrote and then get an A because of my talents as a writer, right? That could mask that I didn't actually engage
Read
with
it.
So it was that was like, oh no, you can put words together, right? And so I think in college it's just being like, okay, what do I want to do to fill my time that's not schoolwork and not party and bullshit, right? Like what am I doing that's like aimed at just the engagement of my mind in downtime, and it was writing. It's just something like, oh, I can just go work for the school newspaper and I can write things. And that's when I started saying to myself, no, I can do this, right? Like people are coming up to me on campus and being like, I like the thing that you wrote in the paper, right? Like I was very much like in that identity of being a writer. Now I will say, I don't know that was good for me to identify as a writer at that point.
Why?
Because I got swept up in the fantasy of being a writer, the romanticism of being a writer, right? Where it's just like, oh, I have a muse that comes down and then I produce these beautiful words and just whenever the mood strikes me and all of that.
That ain't how it works. You don't wait for the muse to hit you, and then you pump out 20,000 words in a couple of days.
You just said I'm a professional writer. If I waited for that, I wouldn't be a professional writer because I wouldn't be getting paid enough to do this.
So you got to write whether you feel like it or not.
Yeah, and I think that early identification with being a writer just came with all of that mysticism of what it meant to be a writer for me, and that I carried that too long. Even into the early parts of my professional career, it was just being like, oh, you gave me a deadline, but like, it hasn't struck me yet. Like, I don't know where it is yet. And it's just like, well, you got a deadline and they want it and they won't pay you until you do this. And they are dependent on you to fill the magazine or put something up on the website. Like, they're dependent on you. So it's a matter of like, I identify as a writer pretty early, but it was to get myself to the place of understanding what it means to be a professional writer, to actually produce. And I'm not saying that I've turned stuff in on time right now. Like that's by far, like every editor can complain about me ghosting on them for a couple weeks.
I always say deadlines are a social construct.
Well, editors think that they're very real.
What's your writing practice like? I mean, particularly for books. Like, are you writing every day? Like, what's your writing practice like?
I definitely don't write every day. Even when working on a book, I don't put words to the page every day. What I do is sit in front of it every day, right? And I think, you do have to allow, in my mind, and maybe this is just me making excuses and justifying bad behaviors, but I do think you have to allow for the doing of nothing. Because when are the thoughts supposed to come to you if like you're trying to force everything, right? I think that sitting with what it is I want to say, the researching part, some of the procrastination, so much of this book in particular came to me in reading and watching stuff that had nothing to do with the book, that had to do with walking outside and making observations and not being like, I'm going to look at my neighborhood to see what can go in the book. It was just like, I'm just outside and I just need some fresh air and I'm just going, and then I see something and it connects. I think allowing your brain that space to be able to do that work without you forcing it is also a vital part of the process. So some of the days where I don't get words down, I kick myself short because I'm like, I just need to be more productive. This will go faster if I did. But sometimes those are just vital days for me to be like, I need to organize my thoughts.
One of the things you talk about in the book is going to therapy. You mentioned it matter-of-factly, but I'm wondering about the mental health piece of writing as well. I know when I write, there are days where I can't write a word, and then I feel very depressed, and then I feel shame and depression, or they feed each other, right? I become ashamed at my failure to do so, and then I become depressed, or I'm depressed, and that feeds the shame. But either way, there are moments where a day of unproductive writing becomes a week of unproductive writing becomes, it's been a season, and I'm calling you like, you wrote anything? I ain't wrote shit. And do you struggle with that as a writer?
Oh, yeah.
And I ask you because you've written so much and talked about mental health so much.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And part of that is because so much of my own identity from such a young age has been tied up in being a writer, right? And it's like, that's what defines me. That's when I'm at my most me. That's when I believe that I'm showing up in the world as myself, and the best version of me is that I'm a writer, right? Like I do that thing that feels like it's inaccessible to so many people, or they just feel like, oh, you do this thing that with words that I just don't understand how you're doing it. It's like, yeah, I want that feeling. And so when I'm not producing that for even myself, right? Like there's the lag of publications being like, I need the feedback, but there's also just being day to day, just being like, I look at a Google Doc and it's just like, you didn't add any words from yesterday to today. You didn't add any words from a week ago. And that little thing taunts you. It's like last edited, and that then is just like, all right, so if I don't do this, if I'm not a writer, because clearly I'm not, because I'm not producing any words, then I'm useless, right? Like I'm useless. I don't have any purpose in this world. That's where I sit, is with that.
How do you fight that? How do you beat that back?
I mean, that's when those things like just getting outside of it help, where it's just like, all right, well, I'm going to give in to some of those things. I'm going to turn on just like trash TV or just like some movies that I've seen a million times, or I'm going to get out and walk. I like to go to bookstores a lot too. And, it's not even just like picking up new books and reading them. I just really enjoy being inside of a bookstore. There's something about just looking at it and just remembering that it happens, right? That it does happen. People get over this. People
they get done. I was gonna say, I know sometimes when you're in those bookstores, you actually do read the books. What do you read?
Oh man, I pick up all kinds of stuff. I mean, like right now I'm on a pretty heavy fiction kick, but I've read Britt Bennett's The Vanishing Half. I'm reading Yaa Gyasi's Transcendent Kingdom. I'm reading Valeria Luiselli's Lost Children Archive. But then there's some other stuff I just picked up. It's actually in the bookstore earlier today. I picked up Layla Lalami's Conditional Citizens. I'm reading Eula Biss, Having and Being Had. I read Eddie Glaude's book a little while ago. When I'm really looking for some inspiration, though, when I need to, I mean, not that it's like, we've talked about him so often as being like, we read him and then we're like, we just can't be writers. But I read Kiese from time to time. Every time I read Kiese, it makes me go like, I can't write. But there is one essay in particular, I forget exactly what the title of it is, but it's his Kanye West essay that's about like Kanye West being better at his job than Kiese is at being a fake ass feminist. And that essay, I don't even know if I can explain exactly what keeps me coming back to that essay so often and what about it makes me like jars loose whatever it is in me. But maybe it's like Kiese doing this work where he's like saying that Kanye is better than him at something. And I'm just like, Kiese, there's no one better than you at doing anything, right? And it's just like, being like, well, Kiese even goes through this feeling, right?
Right. And for those listening, again, this is Kiese Layman. He's the author of several books, the most recent one being Heavy, which is a wonderful memoir. I think the finest memoir that I've read in my life, and maybe the best one written in the last 50 years. It's just such a special, special text. And we've talked about it a few times on the program. And Kiese will be on in a few weeks, hopefully, to talk about the reissue of a few of his other books. Speaking of books, you are on book number 2. There in music is the idea of the sophomore jinx. Mm-hmm. Some people make amazing first albums, and then the second album gets panned. Some people make bad first albums and make great second albums, like the Fugees, right? I mean, and some second projects don't get appreciated until later. We say Nas. I'm using hip hop references because you're a hip hop head, and I often think about that with books too. Like some people, you can win the Pulitzer or Nobel Prize for your first book, and the second book, people are like, this isn't what I wanted. Or you could be a relative unknown for the first book and then pop up. I mean, when I think about Ta-Nehisi Coates, his first kind of memoir-y type book, The Beautiful Struggle, is a wonderful book. But the second book is the one that changes his world and really rocks the literary world.
Yeah.
How did you approach your second book? Did you approach it feeling pressure?
There was definitely pressure. It was pressure like from a business side where people were just like, what is the next book? When are you going to have it kind of thing? But there was also, once I settled on the book and what I was going to write, there was a pressure that I put on myself because I was looking at the first book and just being like, okay, I like that book. And I still love my first book. It's always going to be with me. But all I could think about was the flaws of it. And I would be on tour reading from it and just be like, I wish I could go back and like reorganize this some way. And like, this sentence needs to be flipped. This word just isn't right anymore. Like there were so many pieces of that, but it wasn't even just that, like that normal writer thing where it's just like, you become sort of detached from your old work. It was to say that I wanted to grow as a writer. Like I was wanting to push myself beyond what I did then. I mean, that book was published, I was 29. I wrote it when I was 27, 28 years old. It's just to say, like, I don't want to still be writing like I'm 27, 28 years old.
Right.
I want the new work to reflect
your bigger waist size.
And say that as I'm sitting here, the shit is unbuttoned because
you and me both, bro. I'm wearing gym shorts. My writerly career has marked much growth.
But it's to say, I had certain influences and things that led to that first book. And then I was exposed to a lot while writing that first book. And then in the aftermath of writing that, and like there was just more to consume and more to like shape my thinking, more styles of writing to be exposed to, and to say, like, I'm reaching for that thing now. And it's just different. And it does put a lot of pressure. There's a lot of internal pressure to be, and I think that the real tension there is the distance between the writer that you are in that moment and the writer that you want to be.
Right.
And you're feeling like your talent doesn't match your ambition, that you just can't get to that point. But that's what the process is. It's stretching yourself and like exercising these new muscles to get you there. And like, I don't say that like Stakes is High is the culmination of that, but it is another step in where I'm trying to go. And so like, third book, it'll be a different exercise for me. And then, which is hard to do. I don't even think of the books in terms of like, this one's this successful and this one's successful in this way. Like the first book sold pretty well and was like New York Times bestseller. And I'll say that. But this one, maybe it doesn't do that, but already this one's been nominated for the Kirkus Prize. And like, that's a different form, right? And I want to be divorced from even those things and just being like the product here is what's reflecting me as a writer and whatever subject matter that I've taken on and whatever position that I'm staking out within the literary world at that moment. Like this reflects where I want to be. And I can say that about Stakes is High.
I was reading the text and there was an interesting sentence you wrote. You said, out in New York, the same shit is going on. And when I read that sentence, obviously I thought of Nas' Illmatic album, One Love, the song. And I'm like, you made a textual allusion to a rap song from 1994 that I'm sure some hip hop heads got, but the larger block of your audience probably won't catch, including young people, people born in the 90s.
Yeah.
It made me think of a bigger question, which is, who do you write for?
Yeah, I mean, like that line is for you, right? And it's recognizing that you are a part of my audience and that like I am trying to reach different groups of people. And there are going to be these little nuggets for like the people that I acknowledge, like that's a community that I'm a part of. And that's always going to be a part of me. I'm always going to represent literarily for those folks. It is not going to be, I'm not going to alter that part of myself just because like there's a different audience out there. So yeah, like this book, I can say, this book is a lot aimed at folks who are politically activated after 2016, right? Like it's a lot of it is critiquing them, but there's also stuff in here that I hope is engaging for folks who were activated long before that, who have been involved in abolitionist politics before that, who've been thinking about anti-capitalism before that, right? Like I hope that there's stuff in there that's contextualizing it, the current fight for them to be like, these may be things that I missed, or these are connections that I want to make, or things or ways of thinking about this that I can then translate for people. So there's different audiences that I'm serving here. If I'm like forced to like answer the question in sort of a neater way, I'm always just writing for people. Like it's very basic. I'm writing for people that are looking at the world and saying, man, that's fucked up. And they just want to say like, isn't that fucked up? And then me just being like, yes, it is. Like, yes,
I like that.
It is.
I like that. All right, speaking of things that are fucked up, it's time for a game I like to play. It's called Buy It, Borrow It, or Burn It.
Sure.
I can tell from your tone you're familiar with the game, and you already sound resentful of it.
I'm familiar, and I disapprove.
Oh, then you are going to make my day, because my pleasure, it comes from the disapproval of my guest. Your tears are my nectar. So here are your three choices. And again, you can buy it, you can borrow it, or you can burn it. The first choice is Heavy by Kiese Layman. The second one is No Ashes in the Fire by Darnell Moore.
Jesus Christ.
And the third is I'm Telling the Truth, But I'm Lying by Basi Ikpi.
Jesus Christ.
Now, for those that don't know, not only are these 3 amazing memoirs, all 3 of these are wonderful, beautiful books, but they're also all 3 close friends of Mychal's. So this raises the stakes of the torture exercise that I'm engaged in right now.
You know, you relish being an asshole, and
it's my joy.
Oh, shit. Okay. I'm going to buy Bossy's book.
Tell us why.
You know, I think of that book as something to keep close, because there simply isn't another book that is doing the things that she's talking about in terms of exploring the inside of bipolar disorder from a Black woman's perspective. Like, there's just no other text like that. And, you know, she's obviously a skilled writer and doing things with the form that, you know, we haven't seen.
By the way, it is an extraordinary book. It's beautifully written. I mean, she's a poet as well as an essayist, and the poetry drips from the page as just as much as the brilliant insights. It's creative. It's well written. It's really one of the best books I read last year. And of course, Bossy will be on the program in a couple of weeks. But it is an amazing, amazing book. What are you borrowing and burning?
That's what I'm gonna do.
Oh, you can't. See, when a person talks like that, it's not about to cheat.
No, I'm not going to cheat. I'm not going to cheat. I'm going to burn heavy. And this is what I'm going to say. It's similar reasoning that Mickey Kendall gave
for Burning Beloved.
It's just being like, look, that should take me to a place that I just don't want to go.
That's fair. That is fair. We burn it heavy because you burning it because it takes you to a place you want to go. I'm burning it because it makes me feel like I can't write worth shit.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It does that on so many levels, right? Make you feel like you can't write, and then just being like telling, man, I read that book and I'm just like, man, the honesty of this. I'm like, you telling too much truth. Like, you know.
Woo. No, that's real.
I'm borrowed Darnell's No Ashes in the Fire. Also, another wonderful memoir. You know, again, doing things that, like, I feel like with that one, it's not to say that Black gay men have not written their stories in their memoir before, but what Darnell does a lot in that is to also connect that to a sense of home and structural issues of New Jersey and his love of it, his home and love of family, but also to reckon with the violence and to do the work that I know him to do so often, is to like place himself within the situation of complicity and understanding his position within that. It's encompassing all of those things, and it's beautifully done. So we're borrowing No Ashes in the Fire.
Those are great choices. You can't go wrong or right with them choices, right? And whatever you do, you're going to regret it. You know what I mean? And you're going to feel like it's an impossible set of choices. That's why I chose those books for you. But you did well, man. I'm proud of you. And more importantly, I'm proud of you as a writer. I'm proud of you as a thinker. I'm proud of you as a truth teller. And this book is such a courageous and insightful and necessary, really urgent text. This is the book we needed at this time, and I'm so grateful that you rose to the challenge of writing it. Stakes is High, Life After the American Dream is an amazing book, and thank you again for writing it. Thank you for hanging out with us. But where can people find you? People want to follow you on social media and stuff.
On Twitter, which I'm not as active on anymore, but you know, every now and then. On Twitter, Mychal Smith. Make sure you know how to spell it, Mychal. And then on Instagram, it's Mychal Denzel. Go to my website and contact me, marclamonthill.com, and that also could connect you to folks that, you know, represent me and get me paid. So if you want to pay me, you can get connected to those people.
Absolutely. There's a rumor in the street that you are writing the memoir or autobiography of MC Hammer. Is that true?
I would never take a job away from you, Mark. I would never do that.
I love Hammer, but Mychal is the world's biggest MC Hammer fan. We have an ongoing battle about who is the biggest MC Hammer fan. So
you dance backup for him, so there's no way I could be a bigger fan.
I'll let you have that. Since I got you a buy it, borrow, burn it, you can have that one, bro. I will see you later, man. It's a pleasure to have you. Love you, man.
Love you.
Thank you for listening to Coffee and Books. Make sure you follow us on Instagram with the handle Coffee and Books Show. Also, you can buy all the books that have been discussed here on bookshop.org/UncleBobbies, or you can go to UncleBobbies.com. That's Uncle BOBBIES.com.